All eyes will be on Boris Johnson's response at PMQs tomorrow. It would be surreal if the Prime Minister were to insist he'll wait for a senior civil servant's report to tell him whether he attended a rule-breaking party in his own garden. So will it be good night Vienna? Our political editor Nick Watt understands the men in grey suits may soon be massing. We'll be discussing how close Boris Johnson could be to exiting Downing Street. Also tonight, the prison where this woman suffered the agony of stillbirth is damned in the Ombudsman's report. It called her treatment a serious error of judgment.
Her skin was perfect, she was a perfect baby, and she died due to error.
Good evening. Boris Johnson loves a classical quote. He litters speeches and interviews with them. So some might wonder tonight if he has pondered Cicero's words. Take from a man his reputation for probity, and the more shrewd and clever he is, the more hated and mistrusted he becomes. The Prime Minister is being asked a simple question. Did he or did he not attend a Downing Street party which took place on May the 20th, which seems to have been explicitly against the rules? Rules for everyone, including the government. The man who leads this country had left hospital a little over 5 weeks earlier, announcing with great gratitude that the NHS had undoubtedly saved his life. But despite his personal knowledge of the gravity of the virus, did he countenance party-going in the Downing Street garden and take part? He has so far refused to deny it. The leader of the Scottish Tories, Douglas Ross, was unequivocal today. He said Boris Johnson should not wait for Prime Minister's questions tomorrow to answer the question. He should do it today. Well, today is slipping away, but Boris Johnson's predicament is certainly not. Nick Watt is here. Nick, how close do you think it is for Boris Johnson to be taking a fall?
Well, I do have to say, Kirsty, that there was a noticeable ebbing away of Boris Johnson's authority today amongst his MPs, and talk about whether we are nearing the end of his premiership. So just listen to this. This is one senior Conservative MP who is a Brexiteer, and this is what they told me. It's good night, Vienna. We can't go on like this. It's a joke. It's a shambles. We are reaching a tipping point. And they said that the party can't wait for the report by Sue Gray. They've got to move themselves. And this MP said that they believe that letters are going into Sir Graham Brady, that's the chairman of the 1922 committee. If 15% of the Parliamentary party expressed no confidence in the Prime Minister, then there would have to be a no confidence vote. But interestingly, this MP said that they think what might be more likely is a deputation to the Prime Minister. And I said, well, that sounds very much like the men in grey suits, or should we say the men and women in grey suits. That's the executive of the 1922. And this person said, we are moving towards that. We just cannot go on like this. Interestingly, I was talking to another grandee. They said to me, the atmosphere is not febrile. The thing about a febrile atmosphere is you can pull that back. This person said to me, the atmosphere is one of resignation.
So how do you think this could play out?
Well, there is clearly a lot of thinking going on. I was speaking to another very senior figure who would be very familiar with the workings of the men and the women in grey suits. And they've obviously thought about this. They said the key moment is, what are the newly elected, the 2019ers, what are they going to do? And this person said to me, they are the key, they are really worried, they do not see a way forward. They believe that Boris Johnson is a liability for him. And this person said that if those MPs go to see the chief whip and say it's over, that is the moment when things would start to move. Now, interestingly, I was talking to another former minister. This is someone who's been a big supporter of Boris Johnson, and they were talking about how they're worried about whether Boris Johnson has been wholly truthful about these parties. They said that Boris Johnson is like a greased piglet who always slips through your hands, he always escapes. And this person said they think time is running out. They said there must be a contest, but not now. Wait till the autumn, because they say that a nightmare is coming down the tracks. Cost of living tax rises in April. It would be very unfair to bequeath that to an incoming Prime Minister.
And you also were speaking to an ally.
Yes, I did speak to an ally of the Prime Minister saying, look, it's not looking good, but they believe that he will get through this. He will get through the Sue Gray report, and the important thing is Downing Street is his residence. He is entitled to go into the garden. They think that
what,
he
with
will...
30 others?
Well, you could say it's his residence and it's also a workplace, a unique situation. That might be difficult to argue, but that's what they're saying. And they say, look, don't forget the circumstances. There were no vaccines and it was like a warlike situation. So look, quite a day. Boris Johnson cannot get away from questions about those parties 2 years ago. An early and welcome start to summer in troubled times. The allure of the sun tempting people outside, usually in line with lockdown rules, though with frequent pushing of the boundaries. England in May 2020, a frightened nation generally complying with instructions from its Prime Minister. But in one corner of the land, another set of rules appeared to apply. Bring a bottle to the Downing Street garden went the missive, which attracted scores of staff, including Boris Johnson, according to eyewitnesses.
Thank you,
A revelation which prompted an urgent question in Parliament. No Prime Minister and just a smattering of Conservative MPs to hear a junior minister.
I apologise again, unreservedly, for the upset that these allegations have caused.
Labour criticised the Prime Minister's non-appearance.
His absence speaks volumes, as does his smirks on the media. The public have already drawn their own conclusions. He can run, but he can't hide.
And from the DUP, the human cost.
In Northern Ireland, we reached a milestone of 3,000 deaths due to COVID just last week. 3,000 people who followed the rules and grieved today. So will the paymaster, including my mother-in-law who died alone, will...
A moving moment which came as Conservative MPs asked whether Boris Johnson has been entirely frank. Only a month ago, he was clear when a video emerged of his staff making light of a different party.
I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip.
The atmosphere in Parliament has darkened today for Boris Johnson. Grim-looking Conservative MPs have been huddled together in groups, holding intense conversations about his future. The sands are shifting beneath the Prime Minister, one grandee told me. One senior Tory believes the Prime Minister's explanation that he's always followed the guidance is difficult to sustain.
The Prime Minister may well have believed he was on the right side of the rules, and you know, it may still be proven that he was, but I think it's the optics of it, that terrible political word that I hate so much. I mean, the public will think that there was a lot of fun happening in the garden of Number 10, and it may well have been professional colleagues talking to each other, but the fact that there was alcohol there and allegedly this email exists, you know, it's very, very difficult for the Prime Minister.
A Conservative peer and commentator believes this is a perilous moment for Boris Johnson.
Of course it's a moment of jeopardy for Boris Johnson. Look, it comes at a time where there's in any case a cost of living squeeze, where in any case the Conservative Party has been in power for a long time, where in any case his factional base inside the party isn't that large. So it comes at a moment where he's got other troubles. But any Prime Minister would be in difficulty if they breach the fairness norm in this way, and if ministers and MPs can't find a way to explain to their constituents what exactly went on. These are people who've got to fight their own elections. They've got to also hold their heads up. And when a moment comes when they find it difficult to do either of those things, well, of course, the Prime Minister's in jeopardy.
And Labour believes the Prime Minister has been untruthful.
He's clearly lied. He's clearly kept on lying and hoping that the truth wouldn't catch up with him. It has caught up with him, and now he needs to fess up and face the consequences. This dissembling, this smirk that is driving most of the country up the wall that comes across his face whenever he actually tells a porky. It's all got to end. He's got to be honest and truthful. Those who've been bereaved demand it, those who followed the rules demand it, the country demands it.
An era we will never forget, when the sun shone relentlessly and we grieved collectively. A legacy leaving difficult questions for the Prime Minister.
Nick Watt, well, we did bid the government on this, but they declined to join us tonight, as did a host of Conservative MPs and other party figures. We're joined now by the leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford, and in a moment by the Conservative peer Baroness Ros Altman. Good evening to you both. Ian Blackford, I mean, you call for Boris Johnson to go almost on a daily basis. So what makes this any different?
Well, I did call for him to go a few weeks ago. That's on the basis of everything that we knew that had happened then. I think when you see the public reaction to what's going on, and people that were behaving as the way they were expected to, recognising that they couldn't be with their loved ones, couldn't be with loved ones when they were dying in hospital, couldn't visit their elderly relatives in care homes, and they see the imagery of everything that's going on. The stories of the parties have been around for weeks, they haven't gone away, but it's the explosive details of what came out yesterday of the principal private secretary of the Prime Minister inviting people to a bring your own booze party the day that they met.
The invitation was from Principal Private Secretary. It wasn't, as I understand it, from the Prime Minister.
No, it did say the invitation was from we, it wasn't from I. So let's remember all of that. And that could only have been done. This was the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, so let's not forget that. And the Prime Minister can't hide behind him. And the fact is that an hour after the Culture Secretary gave a press conference in Downing Street reminding people that you could only meet outdoor with one other person, and invitations had gone out to 100 people to come and meet in the Downing Street garden. People really are offended by a government that simply didn't seem to know how to behave, that really behaved with contempt. And you saw, if I may say so, Kirsty, you saw the Prime Minister when he was questioned about this yesterday, laughing, in effect laughing to the public.
But in the end, does the public care more about the Prime Minister attending parties, or the fact that at that time he was very busy getting a vaccine programme in place that ultimately did very, very well for the United Kingdom?
You're judged by your actions, and the fact is the Prime Minister has behaved in a way which has been contemptuous to the public. Of course, we can all celebrate the success of the vaccines, but when people were making enormous sacrifices, to see a Prime Minister that has behaved the way that he has done. And let's not forget that when he came to the House of Commons and said people had to be held accountable for their actions, and it's not just about this, it's everything that's gone on with the COVID contracts. It's about the Tory donors that end up in the House of Lords. There's the stench of sleaze and corruption about this government, and even Tory MPs now are very much of the view that this is over for Boris Johnson.
Well, that's the substance, but let's look at the politics of this, because it would be fair to say, would it not, that the SNP would be quite happy for Boris Johnson to stay in place, because he is, and it has been proved to be, unpopular in Scotland. That suits you very well.
He's staggeringly unpopular. I suggest now not just in Scotland but right throughout the United Kingdom. We have to win our own arguments in Scotland. Of course, I want Scotland to become independent. We'll win that debate on the basis of the proposition that we put. But we can't stand back and allow someone to behave the way that the Prime Minister has done. He really needs to understand that he has to go. He should be resigning tonight. And if he doesn't do that, Conservative MPs need to hold him to account.
Thank you very much, Ian Blackford. Ros Altman, are you embarrassed tonight to be a member of a Boris Johnson-led Conservative Party?
Well, Kirsty, this isn't about one person. This is a big issue, a national issue for our country and what kind of country we are. It's about what leadership our country needs. And it has a moral dimension, it has a human dimension, as well as a legal dimension. And I do think that, listening to colleagues across the House, there is horror. People are horrified at what appears to have happened. And if it's established, we've had comments from people like Ruth Davidson, who are saying, and I totally agree, what seems to have happened is utterly indefensible. And we cannot have a country where the leadership believes it can make rules for others and break them itself. That's simply not acceptable. It's not what Conservatives, right-minded people across the country either would normally expect. So this isn't about one person. That email was sent to a large number of people, and it looks to me like a spoof. It looks to me as if it cannot be.
And indeed, some people apparently responded thinking, you know, it was either a spoof or there'd been some terrible mistake. You say it's not just about one person, but Boris Johnson is the leader of this country. If he was either to come to the House ahead of Prime Minister's questions and issue a statement and say, well, he was at the party, I put the same thing that I put to Ian Blackford, you know, would that make a difference given that this was a person who managed to get the vaccine rollout right for the UK, put it in the hands of the person, I should say, that got it right for the UK? That should presumably stand him in good stead with some people.
Look, I am really, really upset at what is happening because actually where we are in this country on the pandemic now is that we've got a successful vaccine program. We've got people who wanted to be protected are now protected. The most recent decision that has been made not to follow the medical statistical models that suggested catastrophe with Omicron and not to lock down, but to wait and see what happens has been proved to be right. We have saved a lot of pain and anguish, but all of that is being overshadowed by this potential that actually what may have happened is that the leadership of the country, in the middle of the most draconian restrictions on people's personal and private lives, which caused enormous pain and suffering and loneliness for people, was being overridden for certain individuals or groups in a way that is utterly unacceptable outside a kind of authoritarian regime where the public don't have a say.
So in order to cauterise this and perhaps set the Conservative Party on a different track, do you think that Boris Johnson, if indeed he was at that party, do you think he should now resign and there should be, I mean, we've heard from Nick Watt that, you know, the men and women in grey suits are massing. Would it be better for both the party and the country, do you think, to take that step?
Look, if there was a party, anyone who attended it was breaking the law. And if those who were attending and breaking the law include a prime minister, then obviously the position becomes untenable. That needs to be established. I am very perplexed as to why there hasn't been a clarification so far. I understand there will be a statement tomorrow. I hope that will clarify.
Prior to the Prime Minister's questions, yes.
Correct.
That's what we understand.
You know, this can't go on. So, the public deserve better. So we have been through terrible times in this country. There has been so much pain and suffering.
So very quickly, Ros Almond, would it be completely indefensible if Boris Johnson said tomorrow, I am going to wait for the permanent secretary in charge of the reporting into parties to report, rather than saying whether or not he was at the party?
I would consider that indefensible. There has to be a clarification tomorrow where we know what happened, we understand whether laws were broken, we understand what the leadership of this country believes is right or wrong, given where the law is.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, we'll return to the Prime Minister's troubles later in the programme with our panel of political experts. First, though, today, not for the first time, the treatment of a pregnant woman in jail has been criticised by the Prisons and Probation's Ombudsman. This time, the woman in question is 31-year-old Louise Powell. It was her first custodial sentence, serving an 8-month term for harassment and criminal damage. Last June, a few months into her time at HMP Style in Cheshire, Louise gave birth to a stillborn girl. Now, a report from the Prisons and Probation's Ombudsman says the duty nurse made a serious error of judgment by not visiting her when it was reported that she was in serious pain. In response to the report, Louise has told Newsnight she'll never forgive the prison or the team there for not being there when she felt like she was dying. a warning. You may find some of this report distressing. Our UK editor, Seema Kotecha, reports.
I was in agony, I was crying, I was bent over, and to me, I was dying. I said to her, I need an ambulance, I'm dying.
In September, Louise Powell shared her story with Newsnight about the trauma she went through while giving birth at HMP Style in Cheshire.
I couldn't make it to my bed. I got to the stairs, I collapsed in pain. I got to the top of the stairs, collapsed again in pain. Obviously these were contractions.
She didn't know she was pregnant, and nor did the staff.
I just said I wasn't pregnant, there was no chance, because I was gay, so yeah.
In June last year, her baby, whom she named Brooke, was stillborn.
I was let down, and Brooke was let down by the people who were meant to look after us.
Today, a report from the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman criticises the duty nurse for not responding to calls for help when Louise was in severe pain. It refers to Ms Powell as Ms B and says the duty nurse did not review Ms B's record sufficiently or go to see Ms B as she should have done. She failed to fully assess Ms B's clinical situation, and this was a serious error of judgment.
On the evening in question, we found that when Ms B started having pains, the staff on her house block did their very best to get a nurse to come to see her. The supervising officer tried on 3 occasions to get the nurse to come and see her. And that's what we found was unacceptable, that the nurse declined to go to the house block to see her on all of those 3 occasions. But crucially, we found that staff weren't trained or equipped to recognise when somebody was in labour and to do what they needed to do to support her.
In the wing observation book, the supervising officer wrote that evening, Ms B is having very bad stomach cramps and is bleeding. The duty nurse contacted 3 times but would not come out to see her. Tasked night staff with coming to give pain relief and appointment made for triage tomorrow.
What's your response to this report now that it's come out?
Well, it confirms Louise's experience, that it was inexcusable, that she was left to give birth in a toilet unaided, and that her cries for help were ignored. We welcome the finding that there were missed opportunities to help her, and particularly support the referral to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and we want a full and thorough disciplinary investigation.
In response to the findings, Louise told Newsnight, "The pain of Brooke's death will never leave me. I cannot forgive the prison or healthcare for leaving me when I was calling for help and I felt like I was dying. I was having a medical emergency and should have been urgently helped. Instead, I was left. I want justice for Brooke, so no other woman has to go through this horror in prison." Of course, Louise was in prison for breaking the law, but every prison has a duty of care for the inmates that it holds. Now, some may be surprised that nobody suspected Louise of being pregnant because she had a swollen belly, but the report makes clear that nobody should be criticised for not making that detection because Louise was adamant that she simply couldn't be pregnant. The Ombudsman recommends that all staff in women's prisons should know what to do in the event of an unexpected birth. It says more could be done to make pregnancy tests available to inmates when they first arrive. Spectrum, the healthcare provider to HMP Style, have extended their deepest condolences to Louise for her loss and distress and say they're fully committed to ensure that lessons are learnt and that recommendations in the report are acknowledged and actioned. Meanwhile, the Prisons Minister says her department has already implemented the report's recommendations and important improvements have already been made. But she concedes there is clearly much more to do to ensure expectant mothers in prison get the same support as those in the community, something she says she will continue to prioritise. But for Louise, she says her life is severely wounded by what happened and will never be able to forgive or forget.
The first one that I got was a little handprints and with a date of birth and a name on it as well. And then also I've just got another one, which is obviously a clock with the time that she came out and that she was born and she died, and obviously with her initials as well. She's always with me.
Sima Katecha. The standoff between Vladimir Putin and NATO over Ukraine, simmering for more than 7 years, looks close to boiling over. The failure of yesterday's talks in Geneva between diplomats from the US and Russia to find a way to diffuse tensions over the massing of Russian troops near Ukraine is now threatening tomorrow's meeting of NATO and the Russian Council in Brussels. Russia has warned that unless NATO accepts its demands that Ukraine and Georgia should not be allowed to join the North Atlantic Alliance, it will halt talks if that doesn't happen. Our international editor, Gabriel Gatehouse, is at the Newsnight wall.
Well, here's the situation, Kirsty. Russia has put 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, and in the final weeks of last year, the rhetoric coming out of Moscow was pretty clear. Prepare for war.
In the event of the continuation of our obviously aggressive stance by our Western colleagues, we will take appropriate retaliatory military technical measures, reacting firmly to unfriendly actions. And I would like to emphasise we have the right to do so.
Now, it's this threat that has led us to where we are today, with Russia and the United States discussing the future of security in Europe without the EU or Ukraine in the room. What Russia says it wants is pretty straightforward. Here's a map of current NATO member states in Europe. Russia says it wants NATO to pack up its military hardware and return to where the alliance was in 1997, before a swathe of countries in Eastern Europe joined. And it also wants guarantees that Ukraine and another former Soviet republic, Georgia, will, quote, never, ever join NATO.
We need ironclad, waterproof, bulletproof, legally binding guarantees, not assurances, not safeguards, guarantees.
But here's the thing. There's no way that the US is going to give Russia that. Washington's representative at the talks in Geneva has been pretty clear on that.
We will not allow anyone to slam closed NATO's open door policy, which has always been central to the NATO alliance.
Now, Moscow knows this, so what is going on? Well, partly this is Putin playing to a domestic audience. The Kremlin has taken an increasingly authoritarian turn over the past year or so, even by its own standards, and Putin is more worried about internal challenges to his rule than NATO expansion. But there's something odd about this diplomatic standoff, because despite the rhetoric on both sides, the reality is Ukraine is not going to join NATO, not for the foreseeable future anyway. Ukraine is effectively at war with Russia already, and it has been since 2014, when Moscow annexed Crimea and sent troops back into the Donbass to back a separatist rebellion. If Ukraine joined NATO, the US and Britain and other member states would be obliged to defend it militarily, and there's no appetite for that. In fact, the US Secretary of State has explicitly declined to rule out giving Russia some of what it wants in an interview on CNN this weekend.
What about moving heavy U.S. weaponry out of Poland, moving it further west? Or what about moving missiles? What about limiting the scope of U.S. military exercise? Are any of those on the table?
Look, first, Jake, I don't think we're going to see any breakthroughs in the coming week. We're going to be able to put things on the table. The Russians will do the same, both directly with us at NATO, at the OSCE, and we'll see if there are grounds for moving forward.
Now compare that with what Joe Biden said when asked about a response to a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan towards the end of last year.
China just tested a hypersonic missile. What will you do to keep up with them militarily, and can you vow to protect Taiwan?
Yes and yes. That's pretty unequivocal. Moscow is still focused on its old Cold War foe, but the US has moved on, and in this game of brinkmanship, a miscalculation could have devastating consequences, not least for Ukraine, a country that's become a pawn in a game of chess that only one side is really interested in playing.
Gabriel, thank you. Well, earlier I spoke to the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. I began by asking him what the best possible outcome would be for both sides.
I think the best possible outcome would be an agreement on arms control, disarmament, more transparency when it comes to military exercises. An unacceptable outcome would be to give concessions on the principle that each and every country has a right to decide the alliance affiliation herself. That's a non-starter.
But Russia has made its position very clear that its non-starter is either Ukraine or Georgia becoming members of NATO. Now, NATO has so far refused to give in to that, but there's no sign that the Ukraine or Georgia is ever going to join NATO anyway.
Yes, actually, we promised membership already back in 2008. We said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And it's not just for the time being that NATO refuses the Russian demand. That's forever. I have to tell you, that's non-negotiable. NATO pursues an open door policy, and we will not accept Putin as the doorman.
If Vladimir Putin refuses to remove his troops from the Ukrainian border, what are you going to do? There's going to be no military engagement from NATO.
No, but if Putin were to attack Ukraine, he would pay a very high price. Firstly, we would deliver military aid to the Ukrainians to make them better capable to defend themselves against the Russian aggressor. Secondly, we would help the Ukrainians in all other respects, including economically, and we would impose sanctions on the Russians that would cripple the Russian economy.
But at the moment, Russia supplies 40% of EU gas. The Germans want the Nord Stream energy project to go through as well. The thing is that surely Putin could play very hardball over energy, and energy is in short supply at the moment.
The whole of Europe is so dependent on imported Russian energy. I think one of the sanctions that we could and should impose on Russia in case they attack Ukraine would to make sure that the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline through the Baltic Sea will not be operational. That would hurt not only the Russian pride, but also the Russian economy.
But we know from the past that Vladimir Putin is prepared to play very hardball. He played hardball over Crimea, and if he is prepared to play hardball over Ukraine, you can't keep stoking up Ukraine forever.
Putin has achieved quite the opposite of what he wanted in Ukraine. You have a very strong national feeling now among Ukrainians. Furthermore, I don't think the Russian people is in favor of an armed conflict, a war between Russia and Ukraine. And that's a domestic price. But I think we have the upper hand, but it requires that we stand united in the West, that we stand united within NATO, that we stand united between Europe and the US.
Anders Rasmussen, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
So before our next political discussion, let's look at tomorrow's front pages, beginning with the Daily Mail. Boris Johnson absolutely in the limelight. Is the party over the Prime Minister? A picture of him looking rather downcast out in his official car yesterday. The Mirror, grieving families, medics, Tory MPs, everyone with a shred of decency sends a message to serial liar, Prime Minister in quotations. The party is over Boris. And on the Telegraph, Johnson losing Tory support. PM will not resign over Partygate, says Minister, asked to face the comments. It says down in the body of the piece, Mr Johnson is today, tomorrow that is, expected to spell out his defence of the gathering in May 2020, which he is said to have attended to what will be likely to be a packed house at Prime Minister's questions. Well, we're joined now by Gato Harry, former advisor to Boris Johnson, Christopher Hope, associate editor of The Telegraph and former advisor to Labour's Harriet Harman, and Ed Miliband, now of Times Radio, Aisha Harazarika. Good evening to you both. Thank you for all of you to joining us. Chris Hope, first of all, You, I think, are reporting both that there will be a statement before Prime Minister's questions, but also there has been yet another party at Downing Street. What are the details?
Yeah, that's right. We've heard more details of a party in the private office this time, hosted by the PM's private secretary. More details, more drinks, more around a work environment. And we're hearing that tomorrow Boris Johnson will give some form of statement before Prime Minister's questions. You're saying there, Kirsty, it's going to be packed. It really will be packed. Unlike today behind Michael Ellis, as we saw on Nick's film just then, it will be a huge day. I think a real existential threat to Boris Johnson tomorrow, possibly.
Well, you were saying the existential threat, but does the existential threat mean that he's going to, as it were, be very open about what happened to that party, or will he not do that?
I think he's got to be. The problem is he has said things in the past about other parties. He said before that no rules are broken, Kirsty. He said also that he was assured that no rules were broken. He may say that was about different parties in Christmas time 2020, not May 2020. But there's real fury here. You saw other parts of the news tonight, people saying they hate Boris Johnson for what's happened. He knows that all of his political capital is seeping away like water in the desert.
Yeah, and Guido Harry, it's also known that there's actually very few real grown-ups around him in Downing Street anymore. Now, you advised him, particularly when he was mayor. How serious do you think this is?
I think it's serious at one level because it's gone on and on and on, and it's hemorrhaging, and they're not taking control of it, which is just bad administration. But it's more toxic than that. In the end, I would defend any doctor, nurse, medic who would gather at the end of a really stressful shift and have a glass of wine together before going home. But this is not those people. These are the people who made the laws and prescribed those laws to the rest of us, and then did not live by them.
Other people were fined because they didn't obey these laws.
And at one level, it is a mad diversion from big affairs of state. But on another, it goes to the heart of what people care about.
But are you also hearing that there might be other things that will come out which will show that there's a real problem in the Downing Street operation, or has been?
Well, I think we can safely assume that there were many more gatherings like this because, it seems to be a pattern.
Yeah,
and somebody needs to put them in sort of context and explain, yes, maybe they're unforgivable, but they're also understandable at the time in some ways. The problem at the moment is nobody seems to be getting a grip. And the Prime Minister has to invite an inquiry to sort of conclude what went on in his own house.
Well, Aisha Azarika, looking at this from a kind of political analyst point of view, the 2019 intake are critical here. They've got to make a very big calculation. And what kind of things will they be thinking?
Well, I've been in touch with a few Conservatives, and of course, their post bags and inboxes are absolutely full of heartbroken and raging constituents with their stories of their anguish and heartbreak. They abided by the rules. We've heard on radio stations, people phoning in all day with harrowing stories about how they listened to the rules, they obeyed the rules, they didn't say goodbye to their loved ones, they whispered goodbye on an iPad. So there's a lot of anger, but I think there's quite a lot of shame and embarrassment as well from a lot of MPs, Conservative MPs. Whatever wing of Conservative politics you're on, whatever wing of politics you're on, you want Downing Street to be a professional, sober, or professional organisation, particularly during a pandemic. And you just referred to yourself. What we're just hearing about is when we were all locked down, when the country was under the most draconian civil liberty restrictions in modern history, it does feel like it was party central at Downing Street. It feels like Downing Street morphed into some kind of frat house during the pandemic.
And of course, we know that people were under huge amounts of pressure. I mean, people that work for the government, civil servants, were under huge amounts of pressure. We're also hearing that there may be further videos coming out which implicate perhaps... Yes, tell me about that, Christopher Hope.
Well, that's definitely what I've been told by ministerial sources.
And who are in these videos?
Well, no one knows yet. As ever, we're waiting to see what happens. It appears to be an orchestrated drip of stuff on someone's computer or phone, because I've been told tonight there could be videos, photos, audio of said parties, and that will make it feel so real and so insulting to those who followed the rules last May.
So, Guido, what exactly should the Prime Minister say tomorrow?
Well, classically, you should get ahead of this. You should assume that people know enough and are calculating even more to get the sort of picture to form a judgment. So you've got to put that in context. He's got to say, there's a reason, it was understandable at the time, but it wasn't acceptable. And I can see that, and I can see because of the pain you went through, that whatever pressure they're on, and they were not there partying, they were there working and having a drink at the end of the day. So that's
it was an
understandable,
organised party.
but it was against the rules, and the rules were passed by the people present. So that's why it's a problem. And in the end, there's nothing short, really, apart from context and a grovelling apology, a really grovelling apology.
Because Chris Hope, you know, we look back, you know, we're sitting here as a 73 majority here, you know, that's going to be hard to recreate. And so that, again, I was talking to Aisha there about what would happen to the 2019, what's the judgment they have to make. And, you know, and she talks about shame and so forth. But the fact is that in the end, it was Boris Johnson who united different factions of the party and delivered a stonking victory. You know, is there the absence of an obvious follow-on candidate?
Right now there is. I think we're very much in kind of 2017 territory, if you think of your recent Tory history. Theresa May didn't win that majority in the election in 2017, but there was no one around her to really challenge. There's no head of steam behind anybody. Don't forget, it's the Tory MPs who've got to dethrone Boris Johnson, and then 150,000 Tory members. So think about those people when you think of a future leader. I think someone like Priti Patel is quite an outsider. Liz Truss is well known to be up for it. Others, maybe Rishi Sunak, a bit green, possibly. There's no one obvious, I think. And that's what we'll say. It's very hard to winkle out a sitting Prime Minister.
Yes, but presumably, Aisha Hazarika, you can't just hang on to Boris Johnson in the hope that he'll limp onto the autumn until the rest of the Conservatives can get their ducks in a row if it ends up bleeding in poll ratings.
Absolutely. Look, the unique selling point about Boris Johnson is that he's been a winner. As soon as he starts to not look like a winner, the Conservative backbenchers, I think, will be quite ruthless. I mean, goodness knows how he's going to get through Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, because the obvious question is, were you or were you not at the party? He doesn't need Sue Gray to answer that question. It's going to be very difficult to get through that. We'll see what the Sue Gray report says. But remember, there are local elections coming up this year as well. The Fixed Term Parliament Act is going to be possibly repealed. And if the local elections go very badly for Boris Johnson, I do think the knives really will be out for him from his own.
Thank you all very much indeed. And of course, we'll be back tomorrow night with the latest after Prime Minister's questions. I'm sure you'll all be glued to the television. But that's all from us tonight. Goodbye.